All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome everyone to day 3 of the Future of Speech Online, hosted by Center for Democracy and Technology and the Charles Koch Institute. My name is Emma Alonso, and I'm the director of the Free Expression Project for CDT. As those of you who joined us on Monday and Tuesday know, the theme of this year's FOSO is security and freedom of expression. And we're going to be spending this week digging into important issues at the intersection of technology, speech, and our democracy. On Monday, we learned about the technical and policy questions that have motivated encryption policy debates over the years. And yesterday, we heard about how encryption and secure communications are supporting activism, organizing, and social movements, and how various legislative proposals in the US and around the world could jeopardize this crucial democratic activity. Today, we'll be digging into the fascinating and really important topic of content moderation in end-to-end encrypted systems. But first, I want to walk through a few quick housekeeping notes. So we're running this week's sessions through Zoom webinar and a YouTube live stream. So just be aware that the session is being recorded. You'll be able to find that recording on CDT's YouTube page after the event. Our conversation today will run until 12 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to be taking audience questions throughout the session. If you're connecting through the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. And if you're following on the live stream, you can still submit questions via email at questions@cdt.org or via Twitter @senddemtech. CDT's communications manager, Elizabeth Seeger, will be monitoring these channels and will pass those questions along to our panelists. And now I'm really excited to introduce our fabulous panelists. We have Seni Kamara, the associate professor at Brown University, Rihanna Pfefferkorn, associate director of surveillance and cybersecurity at Stanford University, and Claire Zhao, co-founder of the Trust and Safety Professionals Association. So I think I want to start with this conversation that we're going to have about content moderation in end-to-end encrypted systems. I'm going to come first to Clara to give us a little bit of a framing of the problem. So Clara, before you helped to found the Trust and Safety Professionals Association, you also spent some time in the US government. Can you tell us a bit about the kind of tensions that you encountered in your work for the US government between issues of privacy and security and content moderation and law enforcement goals?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today on this panel with such wonderful experts on this incredibly important topic. So first off, I spent the last few years under both Obama and Trump administrations working on both terrorist content online and online disinformation more broadly, including foreign influence operations, specifically at the Department of Homeland Security as the chief technology officer of 2 task forces there. And during that time, it is incredibly important for when it comes to domestic terrorism and terrorist content that may or may not be considered legal by US government standards, to also protect users' privacy. And specifically in areas like countering violent extremism or terrorism prevention, where there might not be necessarily a group that puts out hate that is considered a terrorist organization. It is really hard legally already in that gray area to decide whether that content can be taken down. And there has been only more and more increased collaboration between governments and companies. In 2016, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism was stood up really as a way for major social media companies to collaborate on issues like terrorist content. However, a lot of times this is at odds with users' privacy. You can imagine that a lot of users have a hard time trusting that the US government, especially an agency like Homeland Security, which also manages immigration and visas, there is a lot of tension over, what is users' privacy, and will my data on social media be then used for other means, specifically if companies are working with some entity like Department of Homeland Security. And so there is constantly a push and pull of how much to share, what is being shared by the general public. And I think around this particular topic, I did want to emphasize that the more privacy we have today for users, which is really good, unfortunately, the downside is there is more limited moderation that would actually happen by governments, for example, being able to protect people, and also by users being able to be able to have content pre-screened. And so I wanted to start with that to really frame that content. And this is not only a big problem in large social media companies when there's bad content like terrorism or child pornography, but this is a huge issue in smaller ones as well. There are startups and a number of smaller players that end up with content that they definitely do not want, and they have nowhere to turn to, nowhere to start. And then they suddenly get, a set of law enforcement requests from governments all around the world saying, oh, you're hosting ISIS content or you're hosting extremist content on your platform, take it down immediately. So new regulation right now is definitely very tricky around how much in privacy should, moderation play or lack of, especially when it comes to content that's illegal, and especially those that are considered illegal by a particular country standard. So I wanted to kind of turn that to my current work right now, which is over the last year and a half. I started a organization called the Trust and Safety Professional Association to really bring together professionals at companies that have been doing this work. And over the last few years, like I mentioned, companies have really ramped up on really thinking about how to moderate bad content on their platforms in what's called trust and safety teams, which are defined as professionals that determine acceptable content or behavior on platforms. And in these trust and safety teams, there are a lot of people that are trying to not only create the content policy to determine what's acceptable on a particular platform, but they're also looking at, you have engineers that are scanning, scanning different sites to really figure out how to quickly take down, mass shootings and content that really should not be there. And this is, something that will only become more and more challenging as things go to encrypted channels. And we saw this with, ISIS as well. There was a lot of conversations back with ISIS moving a lot of its recruiting to Telegram and other encrypted messaging channels. So this continues to be a huge issue. And it's really, really hard to determine what is right. Do we help protect users at the end of the day and allow them to have privacy? But at the same time, we're also going to be having huge trade-offs when it comes to very bad content out there that unfortunately will not be touched in most encrypted systems. So I will start with that.
Great, thank you. Well, and just as a quick follow-up, I wonder if you could unpack for us a little bit this term content moderation, right? So this idea that I think is you're describing concern on the part of law enforcement, or indeed even on the part of companies themselves, that if there's end-to-end encryption on the communications, people won't be able to see into the content in order to moderate it. But what are the different kinds of problems that people are trying to solve with content moderation, and maybe some of the different techniques that can be used?
Yeah, no,
setting
absolutely.
aside the whole question of encryption. Right.
Yep. So there are many different types of moderation. I think most people don't realize. A lot of people today, they think about, I think the stereotype is someone that is pressing buttons at a social media company to say, this is illegal, this is not, let me put it in a bucket. I think a lot of people forget that there's actually very different types of models. There are models where, again, it is more top down, where a company really just has people decide what content should be left up, what to be taken down. There are also communities like Wikipedia, where actually the very moderators are the users themselves that are deciding this is, the type of truth that we want and we believe should be the encyclopedia for the internet. And last but not least, there are places like Reddit where there is a mix of someone who is appointed to be a moderator of a particular group, and they ultimately, as an admin of that group, they get to decide what is acceptable in that community, and they actually write their own guidelines. So you have people really creating their own community rules that are just part of these smaller micro communities. So I think this is a really important part of today's debate, because when we refer to content moderation throughout today's session, we do want to think about the diversity of these kinds of use cases. And at the end of the day, regardless of any of these models, there are professionals at companies that still have to weigh on these really hard decisions that might actually end up encroaching on users' privacy. Which is, what do we do? What is the right thing to do when we see really terrible things happen? And do we play a heavier hand or not? And this was also a huge problem around, really recent current events like the elections in places like next door, where they were really struggling with giving the community its own voice versus deciding as a company when to jump in. So I will pause there and see if you have any other more questions.
That's great, thank you. Yes, and I'm sure we will want to dig in even more on that later. But for now, I'd like to bring in Rihanna Pfefferkorn and ask you, Rihanna, to maybe give us an overview of some of the main law and policy debates that have been happening so far. Like, how are these issues of encryption and content moderation getting kind of mixed together in policy debates?
Sure, thank you. So I think what we have seen in the encryption debate, at least as long as I've been following for about the last 5 years, was that in the last couple of years, we've seen a shift from talking about device encryption and trying to lock smartphones and other devices to really a much stronger focus on encrypted messaging systems. And nobody is also really talking about encryption for web traffic. It's mostly a focus on encryption in chat apps, precipitated by, I think, Facebook's announcement in early 2019 that they were going to start deploying end-to-end encryption by default for all of their messaging systems and not just WhatsApp, which has it right now. And so we've seen a shift, from talking about like what files do I have, or what do I have stored on my device or remotely, to talking about whom am I talking to, what am I transmitting to them, what are we saying to each other? And so that takes it to, I guess, sort of a more, including still the privacy ramifications, but also talking, as is the topic of all of our series this week, about our free speech ramifications as well for these kinds of systems. And I apologize that my webcam, which was not that expensive and is a USB webcam, keeps sort of randomly turning off in the middle of my talk. When it comes to talking about content moderation, I think, it takes the discussion from focusing on law enforcement investigatory capabilities and needs to talking more broadly about content that is not necessarily illegal, and talking about detecting it for users who are not necessarily under any individualized reasonable suspicion and for whom there is not necessarily any actual, individual legal process for a particular user. So it takes us out of talking about, which is something that we see more in the device encryption context, where by and large, it's going to have to be something where the police have to have custody of a device and some legal authorization to access the data that is stored on that device before we start talking about how will they access the data that's encrypted on that device. In the chat app context, we're talking about content moderation at scale, which is to say a priori proactive, by default, monitoring of everybody's communications without any need for individualized suspicion. And potentially to look for content that is not necessarily illegal in all jurisdictions. When we talk about child sexual abuse imagery, that is illegal in every jurisdiction. But when we're talking, as Clara was talking about, terrorist and violent extremist content, that's not necessarily illegal everywhere, or even more regional jurisdictional variations around hate speech or defamation, which do not necessarily have the same definition or the same legal status, depending on what jurisdiction we're in. And then into more recent issues around fake news and disinformation, which has been a big site for a lot of debates around access to encrypted chats, not so much in the United States, but in other jurisdictions such as India and Brazil. And again, where that's content that, from the viewpoint of American companies, is not necessarily illegal at all. And so the content moderation discussion also runs right up against the differences between the robust speech protections that we have in the United States and what happens to those interests, and sort of more broadly human rights interests in the same thing, when we build out systems that may be originally intended to detect only illegal content, but may have ramifications for a chilling effect on what is, at least in some jurisdictions, legal content as well.
And so just to follow up, can you tell us a little bit about, like, what are the different proposals that we've seen that are kind of basically seem to be trying to either create backdoors or just discourage the use of encryption in general in these sort of, you mentioned child sexual abuse material, also disinformation, those are sort of the subject matter drivers of some of these big policy conversations. But could you tell us a little bit more about the proposals that we've seen from some policymakers?
so I think broadly, probably the two that have gotten the most interest or most attention so far are what's called the ghost user proposal, which was proposed by a couple of individuals within GCHQ, the British Intelligence Service, which would entail silently adding a user to an end-to-end encrypted chat discussion and suppressing notifications to the interlocutors in that discussion about the presence of this third party who might be somebody from the platform itself, or it might be a member of law enforcement. And it was sort of one of the earlier proposals that shifted away from what we might talk about as the crypto backdoor discussion, which is to say, let's intentionally weaken and undermine the encryption design itself, into a proposal that, quote unquote, does not touch the encryption, where, and I'll let Seni talk about this a bit more, technically you may not be weakening the encryption protocol and the guarantees as against outside parties being able to monitor that conversation may still be preserved. It's just that you're adding somebody who, hence the ghost appellation, who is still sitting in on that conversation. And so as, other technologists such as Erica, who was on one of the panels earlier this week, have talked about, this still has ramifications for the privacy and security expectations of the user, irrespective of whether it technically breaks the encryption or not. So that's the ghost user proposal. The other main proposal that has been put forth and that has gotten some traction is what's called client-side scanning, which is where there would be a hash of a database of hashed images. Usually this applies in the CSAM context, although it could potentially be extended beyond that context. And there would be a process for checking images that a user wants to send either before or even after it's been received by the other end of that end-to-end conversation against that database, whether on device, which is kind of unlikely given technical limitations, or through some sort of centralized server model to try and do that checking against a database of known prohibited imagery. There's also some talk about how to extend that to text, although text is a much more difficult problem. And this too, I think, has a lot of appeal, particularly because it interacts with hot topics like machine learning and could potentially be applied. And there have been some papers about how to apply this in the disinformation context as well as the CSAM context. And so that's gotten some traction, as well as a proposal for a way that would figure out some way to do this in a privacy preserving manner so that users would have some reassurances that everything they transmit is not getting de facto reviewed by a human, but it still would ultimately require a human in the loop at some point to do review to confirm whether or not the interdicted image or text phrase was in fact an inaccurate match, and that still therefore undermines some of the privacy and security guarantees that users come to expect out of end-to-end encrypted messaging systems.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because it sounds like with the ghost user proposal, it's the idea you still have the secure communication between the two endpoints, but there's a third person involved that neither of the two endpoints know about. So that really kind of is a pretty stark way of violating the kind of two-person model of privacy in that communication. And then with client-side scanning, it's about having kind of something on your own device that's reading and in a way pre-approving all of your messages before you can send them, and maybe transmitting information about them to some other server. So both of which are, again, the message that gets sent might end up being encrypted, but it's structurally, there are elements in these systems that really don't seem to match with at least my mental model of what I'm getting when I think I'm doing an end-to-end encrypted communication. So I want to also now bring in Seni Kamara to talk with us. Okay, so we've got the problem of, if communications are end-to-end encrypted, that means it's hard for anybody who's not a direct participant. It's impossible for anyone who's not a direct participant in the communication to see that content. So how do you do moderation? We've got some proposals out there that are about kind of bringing other views into that content and making it more visible in some way to some other participants. Talk to us about other options. Are there ways of thinking about moderating encrypted content that don't require things like the ghost user proposal or even client-side scanning?
Yeah, so I think, as Rihanna and Erica pointed out, it's important here to distinguish between technical ideas and more intuitive ideas that we're used to thinking about. And so the idea of end-to-end encryption it's a technical idea that makes a lot of sense in the context of designing a system in the context of architecture, but it doesn't make that much sense in the context of our everyday life, right? Nobody walks around thinking about end-to-end encryption. And so because of this, as has been pointed out, it's more useful to think about things like conversations and group conversations or storage, these types of notions. And in particular, what we want here is we want them to be private, right? So if two people are having a conversation, we want them to have a private conversation, or that's our goal, let's say, right, with end-to-end encryption. And so because of this, when we're thinking about content moderation and how that impacts or how that interplays with encryption, and in this case with the privacy properties that we would like, we have to think a little bit about what each of us expects from this conversation. And in particular, if I'm having a private conversation with somebody else, then we sort of, I can expect possibly that person may reveal the contents of this conversation, right? Because it's a two-way conversation. That could happen, and I'm okay with that when I engage in this conversation. And so there's all these sort of higher level intuitive notions that we have when we're talking about these interactions that ideally we want to be able to embed in the cryptography so that these intuitions can be preserved online. And so because of this, there's various types of cryptographic technologies that can be used to do this. So depending on the setting, again, if it's a two-way conversation, one idea that's been proposed is the idea of message franking, so that if one of the participants is sending abusive content to the other one, then the person that is receiving this abusive content can open up that conversation in a verifiable way. So in a way that a service provider can know with certainty that this was indeed abusive content that was sent by that particular party. So if we both choose to engage in this kind of verifiable, private conversation, then that would be, that technology can enable that. There's other ways of doing it where we can choose to engage in a deniable conversation. So if I'm engaging with somebody in this private conversation, but in this deniable way, then what the cryptography will guarantee is that if one of us chooses to expose this conversation in any way, then there's no way to prove that I actually said what I said in this conversation. So that's another cryptographic technology that could be used to sort of change the character of the types of privacy that we have. With respect to CSAM, there are proposals out there that would allow, client-side scanning is one, though there's several issues with client-side scanning, and you're sort of outsourcing the work to the client. It's also that these hashes, as Rihanna mentioned, these databases of hashes, they don't, at least intuitively or at least technically speaking, they don't hide the content of the CSAM. So there could be some issues in storing in deploying these hashes everywhere. Theoretically, it's possible that it could be leaking information about the original data set. So that's more of a theoretical concern, but it's something that we have to be aware of. Other issues, so specifically with respect to CSAM, there are proposals that would allow a system to be, to have encrypted conversations, but still allow a service provider to check for the existence of CSAM without knowing any details about the actual contents of the data. So that is something that we could see. It's something that people are working on now in designing these systems. But of course, this adds one bit of leakage to the service provider, which is whether the content is CSAM or is not CSAM, and that's something that we as a society have to decide whether that's we're okay with that, right? And the flip side of that is also that this same infrastructure could be used, of course, to moderate other kind of content, right? Once it's there, somebody could come along and just change these hashes to something else, or change the content to something else and filter data that way. So.
Well, I'd love to kind of bring everyone together into discussion now. So, and maybe Seni, you could give us a little bit more detail. So this last idea that you mentioned of there being some way for a service provider to some way do a check of whether the image that a person's trying to share through an end-to-end encrypted messaging app is CSAM or not. Could you walk us through like how that might actually work in practice? And then Rihanna and Clara, I'd love to get your reactions. Like how do you think of this kind of idea as far as meeting the goals of content moderation, but also kind of meeting the promises of security and integrity of communications when we think of end-to-end encrypted systems?
Right. So there's various ways that you could do it. Kind of at a high level, what you're trying to do is that the client device. So the storage provider would have a database of hashes, right, that are problematic content. The client device would retrieve a subset of those hashes, but in a form where those hashes are encrypted. Okay, so the hashes themselves would be encrypted so that they don't reveal too much information about the original content. Now, the way in which these hashes would be retrieved by the client is using special cryptography as well, so that the service provider wouldn't know which subsets of hashes are being retrieved. So that's one way to do it. And then the device itself could do a check on these encrypted hashes, so that the device would say, okay, yes, there's some content here that matches one of these many hashes, and then send a bit of information back to the service provider that says, something has been found. So it's a bit hard to explain without going into the technical details, but this is roughly, what something like this would look like. And we do have the cryptography to support this. It's not, it's expensive, right? It's not something that is like super cheap, but the current research proposals that I've seen so far actually have made, quite a bit of progress on making them relatively feasible.
Interesting. Yeah, this is definitely a place where I wish we had like a giant whiteboard that we could share with everyone to diagram out what this looks like. But it sounds like basically a way of trying to ensure that the service provider doesn't even necessarily know what content it's looking for, but still having some kind of check or block against a known image of CSAM being shared through their service. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So at the end of the day, basically, if I were to summarize the kind of properties that we're looking for cryptographically speaking, without going into how it would work, essentially the service provider would have these hashes, but at the end of the day, the only thing it would know is whether there was a match or not. It wouldn't even know necessarily which hash was matched. And it would have no idea like which hashes were sent to the client. On the other side, the client itself, or the device, would never actually see the hashes. It would never be able to actually see the hashes. The only thing that would that would happen is that the device would send one bit of information back to the service provider saying there was a match. Right. This is sort of what the proposals try to achieve.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because I can see from a technical angle, it really is looking at this goal of minimizing the exposure of kind of information, either certainly not the direct content of the communication, but also like meaningful information about what someone is trying to share through this message. But I'm curious, Rihanna or Clara, how does this approach strike you from kind of all of the other incentives that are in play in these discussions?
I guess I'll start a little bit. I mean, when we're talking about incentives, different people people playing different parts of these systems are going to have different incentives in different directions. If I am somebody who is determined to transmit CSAM to somebody else who wants to receive that content, then the sorts of systems that we're talking about implementing with regard to client-side scanning in particular can be trivially defeated by simply separately encrypting content before transmitting it over an encrypted chat app. And that would not be caught by whatever the filter is that gets built in by the provider of the chat app. Similarly, if whenever we talk about these kinds of systems, we're talking about trade-offs, everything about the encryption debate is trade-offs all the way down. And it's important to sort of try and surface what those trade-offs are. So when we're talking about the effectiveness of content moderation, it may be the case that the bulk of people they may catch some low-hanging fruit who are not going to separately encrypt or go to the trouble of taking other steps to try and circumvent and defeat these systems. But it still impacts everybody's speech, irrespective of that, and it impacts everybody's privacy, even those people who are not engaging in any kind of illegal conduct on the platform at all. And for platforms, you know, there are a number of competing stakes to consider, but what their legal duties are may understandably be prioritized above the potential marginal impact on legal speech. And so there may be incentives to try and build and deploy these kinds of systems, whether that is to comply with regulatory requirements or to fend off regulatory pressure. And to sort of say that the marginal impact on legal speech may be an acceptable cost of both reducing the amount of abuse on the platform, period, and to comply with legal duties under different world regimes regarding the detection and reporting of CSAM and other types of content.
Yeah, and just to add to what Rihanna and Sunny have said, I think, you know, the reason why this topic has also been in the public spotlight is, you know, last month, Ashton Kutcher and a few other people started weighing on the debate because Ashton has an organization called Thorn, which uses different, you know, machine learning and tools to fight child pornography online. And, you know, that side of the debate is really around, you know, automatic scanning should obviously continue and automated. In the case of child pornography. But as I mentioned earlier, and as Rihanna had said, there's tons of other content that are not as black and white that, you know, when you think about hashes right now, even today around terrorist content, there's a database of hashes that companies use in the GIF-CT that are constantly debated that, you know, some companies think should be terrorist content, some people don't think it is. And so that's where freedom of speech online really comes into play, is as we think about policymakers continuing to add, you know, let's just say automated scanning on encrypted systems does become a thing that is allowed. To what degree do we draw that line to say we're going to stop continuing to add these different keywords, and who gets to decide why those keywords are added? So I think C-SPAN is a really interesting area. It is much easier to start with, but as we get more and more into disinformation, misinformation, and other areas of gray content, like extremist groups that are not considered necessarily international terrorist organizations, it will be really hard. And you know, a lot of privacy activists are very concerned that, you know, policymakers without the right intent of protecting people might try to abuse that line to really dig into users' privacy and start, you know, pushing against that. So that's all I'll add.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. It's important to have these conversations about the technical capabilities, but then to think about how those capabilities might be used for any number of different kinds of content and in any number of contexts, including to, you know, suppress known political speech and dissident political speech in countries around the world. We got some great questions from the folks in the audience, including one that's asking a clarifying question about hashes. So Carl Landwehr is asking about basically kind of the ease of circumvention of hashes. Can't you just change a few bits in the image and then have an entirely new hash? So who wants to explain? I'm thinking the difference between cryptographic and perceptual hashing might be the answer here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in a traditional hash, either cryptographic hash or an algorithmic hash, you're matching exactly, right? So that's how these work. But for this kind of situation, particularly for CSAM, what's used are perceptual hashes, which are tolerant to some kind of noise. So, you know, there's if two images are close but not the same, they will still be matched. And in particular, it's also robust to adding noise on purpose, right? So if you're trying to change the image in particular ways, then that will also still be a match, right? So these are the types of hash functions that are used in these systems.
And I've seen a good, like kind of very high level description of the photo DNA kind of approach to perceptual hashing. So this is the tool that a lot of different services use to scan for and block known images of child sexual abuse material. It was originally developed by Microsoft, and it's made available in a free license to many different service providers. And essentially, it'll take an image and kind of snap it to a grid and kind of put it a consistent size, divide it into a grid, and then in each of the squares of that grid, calculate things like, I think, the kind of ratio of light and dark, or kind of edge detection, some different kind of features of each of those squares in that grid, and kind of from that set of transformations, calculate what the hash of the image is, so that you can sort of imagine that, like, okay, well, if this was a black and white image or a color image, the relative ratios of light and dark are going to be the same regardless. So a hash based on that kind of assessment will be a little bit more robust to things like resizing the image or changing how it's cropped, or things like that. Another question from the audience, and I think about the kind of this technique that we were discussing, of service providers kind of, without knowing what they're looking for, being able to know if someone's trying to share an image that's represented in a hash database. From David Gossett, would the service providers know that a particular user is repeatedly trying to send illegal material? And could that be meaningful to police or security services? So kind of getting at this question of, so what if a service provider knows that an interdicted image has tried to be shared? What's the sort of implication of that? Would you be able to track that, like, the same user has tried to do this multiple times?
So,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to start by framing, identity verification is a huge area of trust and safety, where more and more companies are looking at how you do identity verification when someone signs up for a platform. Some have explored blockchain technology, even places like Pornhub just recently this week. They are really putting a heavier hand on who signs up and who's actually uploading content. And so I think specifically around that question, a large part of it really depends on the sign up process for a platform. And some are looser than others to really identify who the user is. Others are not, but a lot of companies and their trust and safety teams have done exactly that, look for cues of repeat offenders, and they have policies in place to not allow repeat offenders to be able to create a new account or use that same account. And sometimes that does lead to less frequency of that content reappearing, but other times it's really, really hard to detect. So that's what I wanted to start off with.
And I'll add to that the reason that providers have those sorts of systems in place is because, at least in the copyright context, it's required by United States law to have a means of dealing with what are called repeat infringers in order to take advantage of the safe harbor built in to copyright law for platforms. And so it's easy to envision that if there were to be some increased regulatory pressure around implementing similar systems for terrorist and violent extremist content and so forth, that you could see a similar sort of repeat infringer policy built into any legal requirements there as well. And when we're talking about CSAM content in particular, it is illegal, and so a lot of the proposals around client-side scanning, for example, would necessarily involve some sort of onward reporting to law enforcement, whether that is just directly to law enforcement without the human review being review at the level of the platform, or whether that is review by the platform and then upon confirmation that it's not a false positive, reporting it onward. Because again, under the United States legal regime applicable to CSAM, once a platform finds that has actual knowledge of a piece of content, they must report that on to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And so the fact that there are multiple ways where providers, again, would have either a requirement or an incentive to build in systems that would ultimately end up both probably terminating that user account and then dealing with all of the issues of respawning accounts that Clara was talking about, as well as reporting that user onward to law enforcement, at least in certain contexts such as CSAM.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rihanna, and I think can imagine the conversations changing around what should the contents of those reports to NCMEC, to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, be. If you can report some information about metadata about the user and the communication, but you can't actually report any of the content. That would look pretty different from I think what NCMEC reports look like today. So we have another question, kind of, I think, getting at some of this question about what exactly are we moderating, or what information are we talking about being visible here? From one attendee asking about, are we talking about content moderation of end-to-end like content or metadata, and which part of the communication is private? Is the moderator decoupled from the message delivery platform? So I think what the question might be getting at is like, who's making the decision that this content is prohibited? Because it sounds like we're talking about systems where, our sort of image of a moderator sitting at, sitting behind a terminal at a provider, looking at somebody's post, that role isn't really being played here, right? Or is it in some cases?
I guess I can start off. I think, to that question, there are obviously a lot of content that is considered completely illegal, like C-SPAN material, like everyone else had repeatedly said. And that is something that in every single country, there's really strict regulation around that. And I think, the debate right now in the public is how much should privacy law, existing privacy regulation play, and these two are kind of at odds, right? When we talk about end-to-end encrypted systems. And so with that, a lot of companies actually respond to whatever policy is in place. And I think a big part of the debate is that it is not humans, but algorithms are there at play when we think about hash technology, to be that person, to be that invisible ghost, to look at the material, and that is as some people would argue, is not violation of privacy, because it is a machine doing the work. Obviously, machines do make mistakes, and you can imagine a huge challenge is there might be people that are activists against child pornography material, and where does that line draw on making sure that the content itself is really the right one that doesn't necessarily also limit free speech. And there's been existing regulation that is not even necessarily around encryption and moderation encryption, specifically just terrorist content in general in Germany with NetzDG. And that saw a huge limitation in the rights of a lot of people feeling like they were immediately having their speech taken down when there was a huge heavy hand on regulation there. So I can start with that, and then.
Well, yeah. And go ahead, Rion.
So I was just going to sort of follow up on that. In terms of when we've been talking about what sort of systems could be deployed, could we use, fuzzy matching to try and figure out content that is not already, in the database and give a closeness score there. Ultimately there has to be a human in the loop to try and interpret the results, because, the whole point of fuzzy matching is that it's fuzzy. And so we need to have a way of determining, is this a false positive? Is this a false negative? And, where you set that threshold is really going to matter in terms of what the burden for content moderation actually ends up looking like for that human in the loop step. Because, you might think that 80%, threshold for likely matches sounds good, but at scale, when you're talking about a 20% potential false positive rate, that can scale up to 200,000 false positives out of every million images that are being put through this system. And one of the problems or concerns about these systems that Clara was talking about is that we can't really tell researchers, activists, et cetera, don't have any visibility into how these systems are working, or know precisely like how often do they strike on false positives, or what is the threshold at which different platforms are setting them. We have had assurances from the inventor of photo DNA that doesn't have false positives, but there's some suggestion based on some work that Cloudflare has done that maybe that's not actually true. And as long as the algorithm that supports these systems and the contents of the database themselves must remain secret in order to prevent bad actors from circumventing it, that necessarily also limits the oversight from outside to try and determine like how well are these systems actually working, or how much innocent speech is getting caught up.
Yeah, it's such an important point, I think, that you're drawing out too, of the difference between or the question of what are the false positives and false negatives kind of at the technical level and the basic matching, and then also what might be the false positives of the material that's included in the database in the first place, right? Like there are several different places in the system where error can be introduced. And I think we've got actually a question from Twitter along these lines, a question from Matt Green, Forseni, and I think anybody else who'd like to weigh in. So what do we do if photo hashing algorithms aren't public and I think open to this kind of scrutiny? If they aren't public, what should we assume about their security?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an issue, right? Because how do we know that the hashes are actually the hashes of what we think they are, right? So there has to be some kind of mechanism to ensure this. Right now, you know, these hashes are generated by certain organizations that most of us have trust in, but of course that can always be circumvented. So that's definitely a question. It's not a crypto question. It's not a, you know, technical question. I think that's more of a policy question. But I did want to go back to what Brianna was saying a little bit. So this issue of false positives, it's a really important one. And in the proposals that I've seen, I'm trying to do this kind of matching in a private way. I don't feel like it's been really adequately addressed, because what happens is the following: if we're designing these systems to be really like completely privacy preserving, but they have false positives, then how do we resolve these false positives, right? If the service provider, if the system is designed so that the service provider doesn't actually see any of the content, but we're using an underlying mechanism that has false positives, then there's no way for somebody whose content is a false positive to rectify the situation. And that's a really dangerous like situation, especially when we're talking about CSAM and we're talking about at scale. So, and that's a technical question that I don't really think has been addressed, and that is really, really important to consider, right? And that's even with a very small false positive rate, given the consequences, it's a huge problem.
Right, what are the ways to build in safeguards to these systems? And especially, you know, in the, as Rihanna was mentioning, US law requiring providers to file a report with NCMEC when they have facts and circumstances of what appears to be child pornography. You know, that's a big consequence for a person to get reported to a quasi-governmental entity as a, you know, potentially trafficking in very illegal content. So the false positive consequence is potentially enormous. A follow-up question from Matt: does any of this technology exist when we're in these are, you know, really interesting ideas that we're talking about, or ways to sort of think about designing systems, but are there any kind of products in existence or really implementable versions of this technology? How cutting edge are we talking right now?
What I've seen personally, these are research level ideas, right? So what I've seen are basically cryptographic protocols that have been designed, prototype implementations that have been evaluated, but that's still very, very far from having something that, you know, is buildable at scale and can be readily deployed. So we're not there yet, right? This is still research.
And a question just coming into the chat from a CDT fellow, Alexander, because I'm going to butcher your last name, sorry. What about scanning of text for keywords to detect grooming or solicitation? You know, like the phrase, "Are you home alone?" That's being discussed right now in the European Union. Would there be any way to do that kind of like live scanning of text in a privacy preserving way?
In theory, yes. In practice, that's a different question. So, you know, because again, like when we're talking about actually deploying these systems, we have to consider things like, you know, how long does it take? What are the false positives? Like, are the algorithms, even if we forget about privacy, do the algorithms actually work? You know, like how well do they work? So, you know, I'd say from a practical perspective, doing that in a privacy preserving way would be very challenging.
Yeah, and I did want to add to, thinking a little bit about the future, right? There are actually, a whole group of people working on building the next version of the internet where more and more things are decentralized. And right now we're still thinking about privacy and encryption in a more centralized means of a company or a platform owning a ton of user data. And then, the debate today, right, around how much access should either algorithms, machines, or actual people who do the moderation, how much should they be able to see in between the lines? But I think, even moving a layer beyond that, as we have more and more decentralized means of peer-to-peer sharing, there's and then decentralized file storage, there's a whole set of other issues that become even more challenging that I think policymakers haven't even begun to think about. And that's going to be also something in the future to be even more challenging. So.
Yeah, I mean, Clara, I'd love if you'd talk a little bit more about that. So like, what are the different questions that come up when you're talking about, I think a lot of people do have that centralized model, like I am using a service run by, some company or nonprofit or whoever it is, but there's a server or a set of servers somewhere that's sort of the source of this product. And I've got an app on my phone, the person I'm talking to has an app on their phone, but we kind of ping through some centralized server. What's the alternative model that you're talking about? And what, or set of models, and how does that change the content moderation question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's, obviously a lot of file sharing. Even we can start with music everyone's familiar with, torrents, and when LimeWire and a few other companies, Napster, decided to do distributed music sharing, right? There was a lot of issues around how to even moderate illegal music content at that point. And I think as we think about more and more decentralized data storage, today, for example, 34% of I think most of the data most people touch go through AWS. And there's a lot of interesting debate on where players like Cloudflare, AWS cloud providers, where they play on that side, right? Because they're at the end of the day serving as storing the data in some way. And so as we think about decentralization, there will continue to be decentralization of even where data is stored. There's going to be more and more challenges because there will be more and more limited means of a centralized provider in between to even think about some of the techniques we're using today around even a client being able to look at the data in the sense of, where decentralized storage is going with blockchain. You're going to have miners, and miners that are mining and storing data in certain cases in the crypto space. They're going to be the ones that have to deal with some of the moderation techniques and consequences. So.
And this may get a little bit to a question we just got in, and we'll have time for one or two more questions, and then I'll turn to the panel for their final thoughts. But a question about sort of, I guess in listening to all of this, commenter Gary Paul has a good comment about, moderation models seem to kind of fundamentally be in opposition to privacy. If you think about them contrasting the issue of, I want this communication private, but somebody else is making a decision about whether my communication can happen or not. So what options will users have to just go to the dark web or abandon regular platforms? If a lot of the focus right now is on how do some of the biggest name brands of, communication service providers think about and deal with rolling out end-to-end encryption across their services. But can people just leave those services if they end up compromising encryption or just not providing it because it's too legally risky or technically complicated?
I mean, I think the options will always be out there to the degree that the technology is out there and can't be put back in the bottle to build out end-to-end encrypted apps. However, the question is how many people will bother to do so. The utility of these kinds of content moderation systems is that they operate at scale on large platforms where most people are hanging out. And most, I mentioned earlier that users may still have the option to separately encrypt content before transmitting it, so long as we assume that there isn't, technology built into the user's phone that runs below the level of any particular given app to try and detect that. But most people won't bother to do that. The ones who will bother to do that are exactly the people that the system is trying to catch. And so I do see that the brunt of these kinds of systems will still continue to fall primarily on people who are not, motivated to switch platforms necessarily because they aren't doing anything wrong already on the existing platform. And yet all of their communications are being scanned anyway. And the people who are looking to evade those sorts of scans are going to continue to have the means to do so. With that said, I do think that, there is a role to play just in terms of having these kinds of systems in place just for making these platforms a more tolerable place to hang out. One of the things that we're seeing with alternative platforms such as Parler is that they're speed running all of the same trust and safety and abuse issues that have already been a thorny issue for existing major incumbents to deal with. And those problems don't go away just by going to some other alternative app. So you're always going to be still trying to chase a context where you can both have privacy, but also have, some amount of civility and lack of abuse. And I don't know that those two things are necessarily going to be reconcilable. A lot of people will choose to remain on major platforms, even if they do become aware that their communications are being scanned and they're not doing anything wrong, simply because the sorts of content moderation efforts that major platforms are able to invest the resources to do at scale, at least hold some, hopefully not promise or guarantee, because they're fallible, of making those platforms a more tolerable place and civil place to be.
Yeah, and I just wanted to double up on Rihanna saying the at scale portion, because I think with a lot of the really bad content we're talking about here, the big fear is that, this bad content is going to be able to reach hundreds of other users. And the upside to peer-to-peer technology is it's a lot harder sometimes to spread unless it's in a group setting. Like Seni had mentioned, there's different types of ways that peer-to-peer messaging apps today can be used in other forms. And so I think at least, to some degree, if we can think about limiting the spread of reach, and that's been seen not only in child exploitation content, but also in terrorist content. When ISIS moved to Telegram, the upside was they were reaching a lot less people, versus being able to groom on Twitter to really reach thousands of hundreds of users. So I think that is one positive side of this is, at least we can think about slight limitations on privacy, limiting how many people can reach at the same time.
Well, we are nearing the end of the session, but so this has been a fascinating conversation. There's clearly a lot of really strong policy interests in dealing with illegal content, but also kind of, as Rihanna's saying, being able to address abuse and the fact that a lot of people kind of want moderation out of most of the services that they use. People don't always agree on what moderation they want, but some ability to address abuse or prevent harassment or deal with hate speech or disinformation or whatever else it is. That's something that a lot of people are actually looking for from services that they use. There are technical approaches to having both kind of privacy and strong end-to-end encryption, but also maybe addressing some of this abuse. But a lot of that is still a bit theoretical, certainly not widespread deployment. So I think this is going to be a really dynamic and very active area going forward. So I'd like to ask you all for your closing thoughts on what priorities do you think people involved in the conversation about this issue, content moderation and end-to-end encrypted services, should keep in mind as they go forward, whether that's government and policymakers, civil liberties advocates, technologists and researchers. What should be the guiding sort of thoughts for folks that you'd like to leave us with?
I'll start. I mean, I just always want to try and push whoever is crafting these policies or these technologies to talk to and listen first to the people whose speech and whose privacy tends to get most negatively impacted because they are part of some marginalized population, whether that is sex workers or trans people or other LGBTQI people and other populations for whom the sorts of protections that are built in for platforms tend to redound upon them in a negative way rather than helping to protect them online.
I would say, like, as a technologist, I think we have to be careful in the sense that we can design, all kinds of fancy cryptography and all kinds of fancy systems that achieve various properties, but I think in a lot of situations, we shouldn't necessarily be the ones leading the discussion. I think there has to be more careful thought about what the context is and what the unintended consequences are going to be. And so in that sense, I think there has to be a broader discussion around the technology or the different possibilities first, and technologists should really be involved kind of like once these things have been better understood.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think the conversation around, more technologists involved at the table in the policymaking process is so important, because so much of policymaking happens in the dark, where there might be political motives around a particular incident happening, where there's a sprint to write policy that might have huge legal implications on freedom of speech and marginalized groups and every other, and even startups being able to survive in an environment where they don't have necessarily the resources to properly moderate. So I think absolutely having, what Sunny just said, technologists at the table and also involved other civil liberty groups needs to happen when it comes to policymaking that involves such an important set of stakeholders.
Well, Sunny, Rihanna, Clara, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. CDT is definitely planning to continue this discussion and our investigation in this topic. Thank you all to those of you joining us by Zoom and on the live stream for joining day 3 of Future of Speech Online. Thank you for the excellent questions. Really appreciate the kind of engaged discussion here. Tomorrow's session is Crypto Worldwide, Perspectives from the Global Encryption Coalition on the Fight for Free Expression and Strong Encryption Around the World. It'll be at the same time, 1700 hours Central European Time, 1100 Eastern Time, and 8 o'clock Pacific Time. If you're registered for the event, you'll get an access link for that session tomorrow morning. Otherwise, you can always join us on the live stream on CDT's YouTube channel, and you can still register for the later sessions this week if you'd like to be able to join us by Zoom. You can find that registration info at the @SendTheMText Twitter feed. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope